Welcome, everybody. I am Dr. Dream, and you are here for the It's All Good show. And this is part three in a series that I've focused on called Psychedelics as Medicine. And my last guest, Dave Naftalin, who talked about psilocybin, was kind enough to introduce me to this week's guest and suggested that it might give us more of a broad perspective and kind of help tie things together. And I thought, all right, this sounds fabulous. So this week's guest is James Bunn. And James, welcome to the It's All Good show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Dave Naflin, for the recommendation in the first place.
So you are, I just, I've been sat with your bio and this, that, and the other thing. Give us a little bit of your background and what your focus is to kind of give us a foundation to jump off from.
Fantastic. Well, so the eagle-eared of your listenership will probably notice I don't have an American accent. I am from the UK, born and bred. Sort of worked a lot over there in my earlier years as a solicitor, or I guess in the US you guys would call it an attorney. And yeah, I've been working. Actually, came to this world in a relatively interesting background in a sense. Is that I never had an interest in drugs, so my practice now is that I do drug-related law in different countries around the world. But actually, my first starting spot was I was a lawyer for people who were engaged in sex work in London. So any sort of angle of prostitution I was involved with, sort of basically giving free legal advice around various troubles that those people were experiencing in their lives at that time, and the Venn diagram of those that are engaged in sex work and those that are sort of engaged in high dependency drug use and services, things like that, is relatively high. Like those two sectors cross over quite a lot. I then became a bit more interested in the drugs world, and yeah, I've got some great introductions to people that are doing some fantastic work over in the UK. And it was never really something that was on my radar. It was just this thing that I was aware that other people did, and that it was, I sort of put cannabis and heroin into the same category in a sense, and thought this is what all drugs are. And then obviously that got blown open pretty quickly as soon as I entered that world to realize actually that's definitely not the case, and they couldn't be more polarizing in a sense. So yeah, that's where I sort of started out in this space.
Now, your initial focus, getting out of the sex work and all of that, was on cannabis, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so there was some great work being done at the time by someone in the space called Professor David Nutt, who is a bit of a hero of mine from I read his books when I was younger because in the UK we have a what we call the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs. It's a government department which is meant to be independent and it boasts that it is to talk about anything drug related as government reform. He was on that council and was the chair of that council back in, I think it was 2008, 2009, but was fired for his position for writing a article called Equicy, which was the idea around ecstasy being as dangerous as horse riding. And therefore, if we're going to ban ecstasy, we should also look to ban horse riding, which obviously stirred up a few people and, got a few people a bit angry and a bit annoyed. And yes, hence he was fired for that role, which in my eyes just made absolutely no sense because to be fair, it's a pretty good argument, both are recreational activities, both seemingly don't serve a wider benefit to the general public, but we can get onto that potentially a bit later. And yeah, I guess that really resonated with me. And then a couple of years later, he produced something called the Drug Harm Scale, which is probably a graph that you've seen in the past, maybe, or maybe your listeners have as well, which is around the most dangerous drugs to the society versus the least dangerous. And that was just something that, in terms of harms and risks, that was what I was really into. So I wanted to support him in what he was doing. And at that time, it was a lot more in the cannabis space. And that's where I really got my starting steps.
All right, fascinating. Now, give us an idea. As I said, this is a third part of a series that I put together. First uh, podcast that I did on it was on ketamine as medicine,
Yep.
ketamine therapy, and I had a practitioner who has three centers in Arizona. It was fascinating information. And then, of course, last week, Dave Naftalin on psilocybin. Um, so, what's next on? I take it that with your knowledge of what's going on in the United States, it would seem that, well, ketamine is basically proliferated, ketamine
Hmm.
therapy centers all over the United States. Psilocybin is now in Oregon and Colorado, seems to be getting more momentum to be more widely accepted in the United States. What do you see as far as that goes? And then what's next for that we'll see here?
Yeah, I think using the US as this sort of testing ground petri dish is really something that's going on right now to see what goes on over there and to evaluate basically, is this something that we're seeing less harms to society? Are we seeing better economic costs for people? And also just are people able to heal themselves with this? So there's been a lot of the world's eyes on what goes on in the US over the last couple of years related to drug policy. It's a relatively strange one in a sense because I do have a ear to the ground with lots of other countries about how they're developing. So where I am currently, I'm down here in New Zealand at the moment, and they have some really interesting drug laws around sort of things that can be prescribed by doctors, things that can't. But in the US, at least, there's this really split model at the moment, as you say. So, ketamine is being prescribed over telehealth. People are able to take it home. It's being, in my eyes, slightly underregulated, maybe. I know that might be a bit more of a controversial take based on your first guess, but I think that there it could be some tighter controls on ketamine dispensing over in the US. Psilocybin has had a interesting rollout, obviously with Oregon and Colorado, as you say. I think that some of the problems that the places are experiencing is those that are making the laws around psilocybin don't really know what they're dealing with at this point. Like it's not a common drug that would be used in the same way as, well, I'm sure all your audience know that this is not something that is like paracetamol where you can just take it home and be fine. So I think that the regulators are somewhat unaware of the amount of extra stuff that's needed in order to ensure patient safety. But looking into the future, I mean, the one that's really the buzzword at the moment, and whether it actually takes off or not, I don't know, are all these sort of new novel sort of drugs which boast a psychedelic experience without the trip. Now, that one to me is yeah, it might be a bit of a Trojan horse. I don't know what there's actually going to be too much benefit from that, but it's definitely getting investors interested at the moment because they like the idea of not having someone that needs care over 6 to 8 hours, during that experience and would much rather send them on their way. Now, I think that fundamentally goes against sort of what care should be. So I don't think that will take off. So yeah, sorry, to sort of round up what I'm saying there is that there's lots of different things going on in the US in different levels now, and each drug is seemingly taking its own pathway, with ketamine being the front runner. Um, and I think a lot of the pre-built stuff in for ketamine is going to help with the future rollouts of the other ones. But I would just like to see that one sort of tightened up a little bit because it is a bit of a wild, wild west at the moment in terms of prescribing.
Okay, so tell me now. That's kind of talked about the U.S. and it appears that it's sort of been a model at least to look at and maybe figure out if things are being done right for the rest of the world from your perspective and what you're working on and what you're connected with. What's happening worldwide?
Hmm. Well, so yeah, the worldwide scene does mimic some things that are going on in the US. The places that I think have a very interesting model are places like Canada. Now, in Canada, you can be prescribed either psilocybin or MDMA by your doctor if they think there's a medical need. So technically, they do have a regulation model over there, but it's just through expanded access or compassionate access or whatever you want to call it. And in a lot of those cases, it will be the case that the patient has tried multiple different drugs to see whether they work or therapies, and if they are proven to be treatment resistant and their doctor has a good reason to believe that either of psilocybin or MDMA would be good for them, they're able to dispense that drug. Now, there's a great group over there called TheraPsil, which is doing some sort of data analysis about how this is affecting people. And I like that especially in other areas of the world, the real world evidence is taking a bit of a forward stance on this. Previously clinical trials were really the gold standard around whether You can progress a drug through all the very relevant stages. But the problem with the clinical trials is it really just removes the human element from this sort of medicine. It's so dry, it's so unaware of, if it's the weather is bad on that day, or if, the person had a bad morning, or if they just, there's so many different external factors that to really do it in a clinical model is very, very difficult to do. I do like the fact that other countries around the world are looking at a bit more real world evidence. Um, and just to paint a little bit more about sort of other countries' approaches, so in Australia, psilocybin and MDMA can be prescribed by a psychiatrist specifically. There is some prescribing over in Switzerland as well in a medicalized model. And then also, just more vaguely, there is a lot of decriminalization around the world now. We are sort of seeing the stepping back a bit from the more Reagan-Nixon years of war on drugs in some of those places, which is great to see. So it's places like Spain, the Netherlands, Jamaica, some places in South and Latin America. There's some really interesting opportunities at the moment for people that do want to go and try and experience this to go out and do so, but they have to bear in mind that in a decriminalized model, they're doing so in a way that isn't really regulated or checked. So for all those people that are interested in looking into those sort of things, I would say do your due diligence and do your research about who you're doing it with. But yeah, so there's so many different models across the world that like we could really go by on a country by country basis to see what they're up to. And I've constantly got to keep my finger on the pulse to make sure I'm up to date with what's going on because it's all changing so quickly.
So when you say that there's these countries that are prescribing MDMA and psilocybin, are they, you kind of alluded to it before that there's this aspect of, a 6 or 8 hour experience that someone should be sitting with them. At least that's what we're seeing in the United States with ketamine, of course, and with psilocybin. So if you get prescribed in one of these other countries, are you taking it home, or how is that model looking?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So it sort of depends on the country. So taking Australia again as the example that I was saying before, in that scenario, you have to do it with your psychiatrist. Like the psychiatrist has to be present, which usually means them doing additional training, having a space that's appropriate, that sort of thing. So in that case, it's very much that you do it there and then, and you are guided through the whole experience. But taking the other example I laid out earlier, Canada, when the regulators, which would be in this case Health Canada, decided to make this a potential pathway for patients, again, they used a pathway that was a bit more appropriate for traditional medications. So things like, anti-cancer drugs or just basically other drugs where you would take them home. So in that case, patients are taking it home, and in most situations, they are able to do it at home alone or with friends or with no medical supervision. But obviously, with the team at TheraPsil, what they're trying to do is trying to make sure there's at least a little bit of guiding through that experience, especially those that are taking a very large dose. Because I guess that there is a fear that if something was to happen and it wasn't to be sort of mitigated against or like tried to make better in some way, it could be really damaging for the patient as well. So yeah, it's the regulators are very much like that. The Spider-Man meme of everyone pointing to each other, going like, "No, that's a you thing to do," or "No, that's a you thing to do." Is they don't know how that works. They don't know like what therapy regulation is because they're a medicines regulator, and it's not something they've had to consider in the past. So it is pretty difficult to try and find a model that works at the moment. And yeah, there's definitely the two ends of the extreme going on between Australia and Canada there.
Seems a little challenging. I would hope that there would be more oversight in that rather than, just sort of sending people on their way. Now, as far as other psychedelics being
Hmm.
looked at for, being put out there, are what's on the list? So we talked about
Hmm.
ketamine and
Yep.
psilocybin and MDMA, which did not make it in the United States yet for a number of reasons.
Yep.
Maybe you could address that first.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a bit of a hot topic in this space, so I have to be a little bit careful what I say. But I will speak as frankly as I can, which I think is that, um, again, this is my personal opinion, actually. So my problem with this is the old verbiage, which I'm gonna butcher now that we're live, which is along the lines of "Don't let the enemy of the great be the good, or whatever the right saying there is, which is this idea around people have a perfect way that they want to see this rolled out. And even people within the psychedelic space have this vision about, oh, I really want it to look like this. And what it ended up resulting in is when the Lycos or MAPS went to the FDA and tried to put it through the right process, there's a lot of backlash from even within the psychedelic supporting community against MAPS. Now, I really understand and empathize with the sort of the reasonings that they put across. You know, there has been some bad practice from MAPS in the past. They have been not fantastic. Their PR and communications has also been not great either. However, I don't know whether stymieing their FDA MDMA like process is the right approach necessarily. You know, it's sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to use another verbiage that is probably slightly outdated here. But yeah, I think that was a real problem, which is that people were infighting even within the pro psychedelic space about like, don't let these guys go through, when actually it's not about the company that goes through, it's about the patients that are able to benefit from it in the longer term, in my eyes. And again, very much a personal opinion, that one.
Okay, I appreciate you touching on that. Now, what's on
Hmm.
the list of
Oh,
other
yeah.
possible psychedelics as medicines, that we might see in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, the ones other than the ones you've described so far, or at least the ones that are in people's minds, I guess, is anything to do with DMT. You know, DMT is really hot at the moment in terms of people wanting to find out more information about it. I see it on the sort of back end search engine sort of stuff as well, which is great to see. And this is in two different forms. This is in sort of your ayahuasca based DMT, but also in 5-MeO DMT as well. Now, these are two drugs that I do relatively little work with. I mean, ayahuasca a little bit from the retreat space, um, because it's a pretty hard one to do in a clinic. You know, a lot of my work that I do is clinical work with patients in medical settings and this sort of thing. Whereas most of the ayahuasca use at the moment is being done in a very ceremonial setting, and outside of the lab, which again, previously, as you will have maybe recall, is that I love real world evidence. So, you know, having I would love to see more studies into groups of people that do ayahuasca experiences, but I am aware that there's a huge bias involved with that, which is, you know, why we go down the clinical route most normally, is that if you get a bunch of people that really want to be healed and they go to a space and are told something that's going to heal them, there's a good chance that quite a few of them will experience healing. Now, whether you can sort of attribute that directly to the use of the ayahuasca, that's something that I think is the big question for a lot of people. Now, some people would argue, as long as they get healed, that's all that matters. You know, as long as they experience benefit and they are living their lives in a better way, then great. But I guess what people are more concerned about from the more clinical side, like my side, is if I'm just a person at home and I assume ayahuasca is going to work for me, I buy a, $3,000 ticket to Peru and go to a really fancy retreat and do all this stuff, and it doesn't work because I thought everything I've heard tells me it is going to work, then that buy-in from my side is going to have really devastating effects on my mental health because I'm going to assume it was a me problem. I'm going to assume that there's something wrong with me and that it works for everyone else. And if it didn't work for me, then it's, I'm broken or something like that. So I guess I do worry about like a certain, not a good word for this, like a cheer pressure, like like we all have to get behind this to say that this is great when actually dissenting opinions in this and, problems and risks is actually a really important part of it. So yeah, sorry, again, kind of gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I am interested in the ayahuasca space. I think that and the DMT space more generally. Um, it's just a really hard one to try and work with. And also to do anything like DMT and put someone in a brain scanner, that sounds like a pretty traumatic experience for most people, even not under the influence. So yeah, it's a tricky one to try and do.
Okay. Uh, that's a interesting one for me. I don't really have to filter anything I say. I did go down to
Mm-hmm.
Peru
Mm-hmm.
30 years ago to participate in 2 weeks of ayahuasca ceremonies. It was absolutely life-changing.
Mm-hmm.
And then just in my own personal space, I've always considered DMT, NN DMT, to be
Mm-hmm.
one of my mentors. So for me, it's been a very powerful medicine. I'm not sure how that would translate into a clinical environment, but it was on my list to ask you about. So I love
No, of
that that's
course.
where you went first.
No, I'm really pleased that you asked about it in a sense as well. And when you experienced your side of things, you went and did it in the naturalistic environment first. You went down to Peru before you tried it at home.
I did five ceremonies of ayahuasca in Peru, but what led me there was experiences with DMT.
Mm-hmm.
And then an urban shaman in New York City said, "Hey, listen, I take these trips down to Peru. Would you like to go and have the experience there?"
Mm.
Also did it once in the United States when the Santa Daime were doing a tour.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't really like it. The Portuguese Christian music,
Hmm.
combined with the medicines didn't really work for me. I loved my experience in Peru, but I've carried on my own psychonautic adventures, as it were, with the medicine of DMT, and I very much consider it medicine, but it's been a mainstay for me over um, over the last 30 plus years. And so, and I met Terence McKenna and went to
Yeah.
ethnobotany conferences and did the whole thing really just to get a little better grip on how it all works
Hmm.
and everything like that. So it's the thought of it being done in a like going in for a DMT therapy
Yeah.
or something like that. It's kind of wild to me, and I knew people that were had taken part in the in New Mexico in the studies that were done there with the intravenous DMT and learning about that, and I find it fascinating. And for another time, my own experiences have been beyond anything I could have ever really thought of. Um, but I know that like people can go from the United States down to Mexico and experience ibogaine, and there's been
Hmm.
some really incredible testimonials that have come out of people getting off of heroin and other
Oh, yeah.
addictions and things like that. Are you seeing that as something that is
Hmm.
taking hold, or there obviously there must be interest in it?
Yeah, for sure. I alluded to earlier that there's some interesting stuff down here in New Zealand, and ibogaine is actually one of those things that's quite interesting because ibogaine in New Zealand just isn't illegal, full stop. It's like, I could set up a clinic tomorrow and start giving people ibogaine with no medical background as long as I wasn't claiming it had medical purpose or things like that, just to get around medicine laws and things like that. So just really in honesty, because they didn't really know about it when writing the law, so it didn't get added. It's a quite a basic reason for why it's not a thing here. Ibogaine for me is the problem child of psychedelics because I think that in my mind, whenever I read a news story about someone actually dying in psychedelics, it's usually with ibogaine and it's usually heart related. Like the palpitations that ibogaine cause in patients, and I'm not a medical person, by the way, so it's really important to state that this is just from hearsay and stuff that I hear from people. But it's one of those that I don't want to work with because of the risk involved. I consider a lot of the others quite low risk, and I would call me crazy, but I'd rather give someone like 5-MeO DMT over Ibogaine because I think it's just safer. Like I worry about the length of trip, I worry about the heart, I worry about that kind of thing. Pretty big. So it's not saying that it doesn't work, and it's not saying that it's not fantastic, especially for those that are withdrawing from opiates as well. I've read all the literature and the data behind it, but personally, it does just sort of scare the bejeebers out of me.
I got you. Is there a future for LSD in this?
Hmm. Yeah, that's another good question because, I would have said about 5 years ago, no. I would have been like, I don't think that it's got like things going for it that other drugs maybe do. LSD has this potentially bad PR representation over the years, and therefore, when someone says it, there's just from at least a regulator's perspective a bit of an eye roll, thinking back to sort of Timothy Leary days and stuff like that, and it's very associated with something. Psilocybin benefits from the idea that it's been rebranded as another thing. It's no longer called magic mushrooms anymore, and it's sort of got this grown-up professional name. For anyone listening, I'm doing the inverted commas with my fingers here, just so everyone's aware. And yeah, so I think that they benefit from it, whereas LSD does have this baggage with it. However, I do think that those people that are less inclined to want or see value in something being a purely natural substance. I know people out there that would never do LSD because it's not a natural substance. Now, I think that over like the last couple of years, there have been a couple of drug developers that are really keen to push LSD through the pathways that it needs to, especially in the more microdosing sense as well. And it is gaining a little bit of traction. There's something that I'm not sure if you do show notes, but if you do, there's a link I'd love to include in it, which is to there's a drug development tracker made by a group called Psilocybin Alpha, which basically show you where each drug is in its process of being like from a black market drug to being a regulated substance. And LSD has made leaps and bounds over the last couple of years with a couple of key people whose names I'm really blanking on right now. But I really recommend anyone that's interested in that sort of side of things to check it out.
Excellent. We'll include that link. Um, that sounds amazing to be able to see how that has worked out.
Mm,
Um, and so in all of this, I know that as I was researching you, you were part of a I don't know podcast or a
hmm
workshop or something that was about translating research into
mm,
treatments.
mm.
And I know you've worked with some major foundations and organizations that are doing really important research into all of these areas. What what's the process of taking the research that like some of those foundations and
Mhm.
organizations are doing and having it be into treatments? Because
Yeah.
some of it is, I imagine, clinical, some of it's not clinical. How is all that playing out?
Yeah. So when it comes to translating our research, it's also about making it something that's attainable to the people that are making the decisions. I could try and think of a good example here. Like if I wanted my mum to understand something about computers, I'd have to dumb it down to a really low level because I realize if I talk to her about certain processes in a computer, it'll just go over her and she won't be interested in it. And the same needs to be applied when sort of translating research into regulator speak or even charities and the people you need the buy-in from. So if I see a study that says that depression is reduced by X amount in this patient population and it's really good for all these things, I can be aware of that when approaching the regulators to say, hey, look, they are interested in reducing depression, but what regulators love to do is reduce the cost of treatment for patients because then it saves them money, tax money, and also have less and less patients in inpatient care. So if I start to put the argument across as rather than this is for the betterment of people to this is the betterment of your wallets, it does really translate a little bit better, which is a horrible system to be admitting to be honest. And it's a bit, soul destroying to realize that we work in a system like that. However, it's important to play the game as it is meant to be played. And that's an unfortunate part is really making sure that you translate hard science and years of really intense research into something that is digestible by the people that you're trying to give it to. I think that there's a couple of people that do that really well. So I'll do a few name drops here just for the yeah, just places people can go to check out some of this stuff. So one of them is Drug Science. Drug Science is my UK organization I work with that I mentioned previously with Professor David Nutt. They're fantastic at doing anything UK related and got great sort of links with all the important people that you need to in the UK. And then in the US, actually, a group that I would like to give an honorable mention to is a group called Unlimited Sciences. Now, they work with sort of underrepresented groups in the space. So they've produced a couple of studies recently, one on Northeastern and Middle African peoples and their views on psychedelics and taking psychedelics, which is this group that just really have been ignored for a while. And also some work on the LGBTQ plus communities as well about their consumption and attitudes to shame and guilt. And yeah, I think that it's just really important to try and cast the net as widely as possible when applying to this research, because this is for quite a large section of society, but it's just about working out who it's going to benefit the most and also who is at risk. So yeah, I think that's probably what I would say is that you just really need to choose your audience and know who you're presenting it to.
Okay. I kind of feel like I put you in a position to take you a little bit out of, what your day-to-day focus is. So I want to just bring it
Great.
back.
Okay.
What like what is your day-to-day focus? And tell us
Yeah.
about the organization that you're part of
Hmm.
that most of that falls under, I guess.
Yeah. So I guess this is a slightly interesting tangent as well. So I'll take this as an opportunity to talk about something I just want to talk about, which is that I think I get a lot of people email me and contact me that say, "Hey, look, I want to work in psychedelics in some capacity." The amount of people that want to work in this versus the amount of jobs in this is a bit skewed. And I think that a lot of people want to work in psychedelics because they want to be a psychedelic guide or a therapist, or basically someone like Dave, who you had on previously. And he's done a fantastic job of elevating to that position and being really on it with, when the regulation comes through. I think he was even part of the first cohort in the US that
Yep.
passed. So, really on it. But something I do have to also tell other people is that this sort of sector is in need of everyone from different levels of qualification. We need nurses, we need accountants, we need lawyers, this is a whole movement in a sense that it could get a lot of buy-in from people. And if anyone out there is like, I really want to work in psychedelics, just play on your skills. Obviously, I would say if you want to go into therapy side of things and do it, then please do. But for me, my day to day, I do a lot of legal contracting work. I do a lot of agreements with universities and making sure everyone's got all the right intellectual property and, just kind of now that I'm talking about it, relatively boring, mundane stuff. But I love it because it's doing something that's got a wider mission of something I want to happen, better healing for all. So, my day might bore some of your audience in terms of the actual day-to-day nature of it, but I guess the important part I'm trying to phrase out of this is that like there's just so much variety of working in this space that if you find a company or organization you are wanting to support or work with, then there's no harm in just contacting them and say, hey, look, what do you need help with? What's going on? And I've had some great luck with that in more recent years where I could only have really ever predicted I would have really worked with universities and research organizations, charities, not for profits. But now, in the last 2, 3 years, I've been working more and more with retreats and places abroad in decrim situations as well. And I love it because it's such a breath of fresh air compared to the clinical world of, people being able to say, okay, well, we're going to look at how a massage halfway through affects someone's experience, how doing a certain type of sport, it's such a different playing field, really. And I find it really, really interesting. So, yeah, I know that I sort of took a tangent from you there about like what's my day to day, but I guess that's because my day to day is relatively benign, and that everything else around it is the more exciting stuff.
No, that was good. I was looking for a little more insight from you and just about you and how it all works. Uh, so what are some of the, I mean, there's so much potential, and when I say there's so much potential
Hmm.
in all of this, it's based on my own experiences,
Hmm.
of course, so firsthand, and how it's expanded who I am
Hmm.
and how I see the world. But then also the research and everything that's been done. You must hear so many stories and kind of have your finger on the pulse of what this is doing, and it's
Yep.
become such a focus for you that speak to us about 5 years, 10 years down the
Mhm.
road, and the types of things that we may be experiencing, and what that means for the greater population.
Okay, yeah. So you're speaking to someone who is usually a bit I don't know. I like to call it realistic. Other people would call it pessimistic. So we'll see how this goes. I think that again, like if you would ask me a couple of years ago, I would have given a very different answer. And I think that the tides are changing in the right direction. I do think it will be a lot slower than what other people say. I've had people tell me for the last 10 years of working in this that like, psychedelics are coming next year, and watch out for this summer. It's going to be everywhere. And the thing is that it is a slow process. You got to be aware that this is quite a major change in a lot of medical systems is to try and integrate something like this. So, if we're looking at a 5 year timeline, I'm not going to say anything's going to be too radically different. With all of that said, I'm not going this is one of those I'm not going to go into it moments, but obviously that you've got a particular administration in charge right now that have a particularly quick approach to regulation, and it means that something very quick could happen quite soon in psychedelics as well. Whether good or bad, that's yet to be seen. So, despite what I just said, the US now has this opportunity to, if it really did want to spearhead a lot of this movement in this space. But otherwise around the world, I mean, we are seeing a lot more prescriptions going out in other countries, and also just a more general acceptance towards some breaking some of the stigmas around what's happened in the past. Um, I think that if you tried to talk about this with some people a little while ago, they would have shut off. And I think that will decrease slightly over time. People will be more willing to sort of say, okay, well, actually, no, I'm even experiencing this in my own life. We're having sort of traditional cancer charities, anorexia charities, like people that wouldn't have even talked about this in the past, the fear of being shut down, now come to us and say, look, hey, we would love to do some research in this too. Like, let us know what we can do to help. So I do see the stigma dropping, even if the laws don't change drastically. Now, I would love to see, I would love to see something where we can actually gather pretty decent data in a long term. A lot of the trials that go on really check on patients over the case of 6 months, 8 months. Some of them that are really good do like 2 years. Now, I would love to see something where we have all these things now like smartwatches and data trackers, Fitbits, all that kind of thing. There's some really great technological advances in the last couple of years around wearable tech and brain scans and things like that, that there's just so much great opportunity, like microdosing research. Let's take that for example. Microdosing research is just, I don't know if I can swear on this, but it's pretty shit. Like everything that's been gone in recent years to do with microdosing research is just so expensive to do in a clinical setting that there's just sort of no point financially in doing it. Like to get people to come in over a long period of time, take drugs every time that they're there, and then go home and everything like that. It just means that all the research has been done is pretty bad. But the amount of real world people or evidence coming out and stories of people that have healed with microdosing and do work and do these things, there's something going on, but we just don't know what it is. And to measure it, we need to be more comfortable with gathering some information from people and people giving up their data to build a bit more of a healthcare directory of like this is how it's affecting a bunch of people. So sorry, I guess I've gone really off a tangent there, but to go back onto microdosing for a second, because I feel like I was getting somewhere. I think that there's a lot of people that say that it does a lot of good, and I reckon there's a good proportion of that people that actually does do some good stuff for them. But there's also a bunch of people that it just benefits them because they think it's going to benefit them. As I said before, placebo is a really powerful drug. But I would think that before we can make any decision about it, it's good for this, it's not good for this. There's just a real need to further our understanding of what it's doing in the body and brain, how it's affecting us on a week by week basis, not like oh, this is the start of the day, this is the end of the day. That's where we're cutting off the data collection. Yeah, sorry, you gave me a soapbox and I really wanted to stand on it. So here I am shouting about how microdosing research is terrible. But I'll pass back over to you now because otherwise I'll just go on for the next half an hour.
Yeah, I think the microdosing is really a fabulous subject
Mm,
because people are really seemingly more open to this as a
mm,
discussion point than, oh, the old story of, Terrence McKenna, let's do the heroic dose,
mm,
where it's just the microdosing and it's helping with depression and it's helping
mm.
with all sorts of things. So if you want to go into it a little bit more, I'd be
Well, I mean,
more than open
I'll
to it.
talk a little bit more about it because I do have the strong views on it. I guess the thing is that it becomes a bit more of a publicly accepted thing if someone is sorry, I need to restart that. Like if you're around someone who is under a high dose of psychedelics and you are not, it's very obvious. And it's very much like, they do placebo controls and clinical trials, but in part of me thinks that it's just a big facade they put on because you know or you don't know. Even the doctors in the room, they know or they don't know. And with microdosing, because it's more subtle and it can be seen as like something someone could do and still go to work and still take the bus and not, do something radical or just act in very strange ways. I think that it does have this acceptability around it that other drugs wouldn't, like if you were around people that were doing it, you may not even know. And I think that the public can accept that as a bit more normalized because it's a bit more like other medicines. If you were aware that every time that everyone took an aspirin that they started saying stuff that made absolutely no sense to you, there's part of you that would be like, what the hell's going on? Like there's something strange there. Where if they're completely competent and having a casual conversation with you, it's not seen as shocking, I guess. Um, it buys in a little bit to what I was saying earlier as well, which is that I think that people really want to get better a lot of the time and are willing to put their faith into things, even if they potentially don't work. But we're seeing very little negative side effects with microdosing. So it feels like another one that's like taking ibogaine, for example, as I talked about earlier. I would much prefer someone I know microdose every day rather than takes one massive dose of ibogaine because in terms of safety, I think they're in a much safer place. So yeah, I guess that everything falls down to risks and risk mitigation and things like that for me. But I think that's the lawyer in me coming out.
Are there I guess microdosing is not being prescribed in the US because the psilocybin use is having to be done in a clinical setting or
Mhm.
in a center. Are there the countries that you had mentioned earlier that are prescribing this? Are they prescribing it as microdosing, or is it how is that falling into place?
So most of the places that have a medicalized model are doing the macro doses. They are the larger ones. Microdosing again is less common. The one that we did find quite interesting was in Canada when we were prescribing, and particularly this was in end of life care. People were asking to have less. Like they get their dose through, which was around 25 milligrams, and they would do that. And they would say, "Hey, look, I would really want to do this again, but it was too much for me, and I would like to do something a bit less intense." And it's been actually surprisingly hard that now we're at this really interesting impasse where we will talk to Health Canada and say no, and they'll tell us no, the right amount is 25 milligrams, and we go, well, it's a real sliding scale. So we're trying to get them to reduce a dose, and Health Canada are saying, nope, stick to your big dose. So it makes no sense, obviously. But again, I guess it would be the same. Again, trying to think about it in a traditional medicine sense, like it's like if you had a dose that was for a cancer drug of some kind, and then suddenly a bunch of people say they need to be doing half of it, you need to prove it, and you need to say that like why, and build an evidence-based case for it. So that's what we're really trying to work on now. But really, microdosing is kind of retained to decriminalized places, retreats, less so clinics or clinical trials.
All right, excellent. Tell me, of organizations that you've worked with or been associated with outside of the United States and Canada, who's doing excellent work and what would that entail?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So a few of them I've named already, so I'll spool off a few here. So Drug Science is the UK leader, definitely for that. Unlimited Sciences do some great work in the US. They are also a charity. Another mention for Unlimited Sciences is they also have a completely free toll line that you can call if you are having any questions about psychedelics. So if there's anything that comes up that you wish that I'd spoken about on this podcast and you live in the US, you can literally schedule a call with these guys. It's completely anonymous and they will give you the most evidence-based scientific advice they can on the topic or advise or point you in a direction they can. And there's no it's not like hidden fees or anything like that. They're a pure charity. So they do some really good work there as well in terms of public outreach. But then other ones that I think are relatively interesting that don't maybe get a mention as often as they should. One that I really like is Psychedelic Alpha. So they are actually based in the UK as well. And I just think they produce a really high quality news of about what's going on in the space that isn't financially biased because they don't have sort of ads and they don't have buy-in from large pharmaceutical or anything like that. So they talk about a lot of the issues going on right now in the psychedelic space, as well as another group that is probably worth an honorable mention called Psy Aware. Now, Psy Aware are doing a lot more to do with like regulating and creating code of conduct for the therapy teams. As you know, the other thing that is often talked about, which it should do as well, is about abuses in the space. And then, unfortunately, there has been instances of people taking advantage of others in the psychedelic state and things like that. And these are exactly the sort of things that could derail, entire movements and in a sense derailed MAPS in their submission for the FDA. So people like SciAware that try to get ahead of the curve and speak to the therapy teams just to make sure everyone's doing something completely kosher. They are, make sure there's a male and female guide that goes through people with their experiences. It's just really safeguarding in the basic sense that you would have as part of many other walks of life. So I'm really grateful of the work that they're doing too. And then I guess the other one that deserves a mention because it's slightly different from all the others is I do work with a great you were talking about mentors earlier and yours being DMT. Well, one of mine is a lady called Satya and she works with DMT over in ayahuasca. Sorry, over in Peru with ayahuasca. Now she does some incredible work with sort of the basically preparing people to be able to go through these experiences and also to take on a lot of the learnings that they go through as after they do this to really implement them into their daily lives. And I think she's can boast something like over 10,000 ayahuasca experiences with people, like not herself, but they like taking it, but she's delivered that to people. So the amount of healing she's caused as a, direct result is definitely measurable. And yeah, we're really trying to do some work with her and real world evidence gathering at the moment, but just again, working out the legalese of doing so in Peru is a bit of a hard one. So these are definitely the ones I think that are worth all the mentions there.
I appreciate that. I mean, it's a challenging thing. You can take a cancer drug, and there's no press. Oh, I don't know whether I should. Whatever. There's no pressing need to have like a integration time afterwards. It's like, oh, I'm
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
taking this each day.
Yep.
I believe it's helping with my cancer.
Mhm.
But when we're in the psychedelic arena, being able to integrate all of it and make sense out of it, depending on what the experience is about, seems to be a huge piece to it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
The reverse of what we just talked about, and this is one where I won't mention names just due to the fact that I don't want to, kick sand into something that doesn't need to, is there are quite a lot of bad actors in this space as well. Not even just the ones I was talking about earlier about sort of the abuses of power that they do in the therapy settings, but just a kind of a bit of a gold rush, like people seeing opportunity and thinking, not really thinking it through, but just, pump and dump companies that really want to monopolize this and stuff like that. There's often talk about intellectual property being this great like preventer of scientific endeavor because it stops people from doing stuff, and I think that's a little bit of a red herring. Intellectual property in the psychedelic space is not really as valuable as people make it out to be. I think for me, it's like the sort of companies that go about, and again, I won't mention names here, but there's like a couple of training organizations that try to train people to deliver psychedelic therapy to people. And a few of those are quite disingenuous. They don't actually have the required medical training that I think you should have to have in order to be able to give this to people. A lot of it is very they include really interesting and good parts of spirituality, but you also need to complement that with elements of, science and research as well, and evidence-based stuff. So, I think like groups like the ones that Dave works with is fantastic because they don't fall too hard on one side or the other. There are also the other ones that include no elements of spirituality and psychedelic experience. And it's like, well, you're kind of missing part of the point, I think, a little bit there. So, yeah, having a balance of those two is really important. And I do think that despite what I said earlier about, oh, look, these great jobs that are in the psychedelic space get involved and everything like that, also have to have a think about why you're getting involved in it because there is a little bit of money to be made in this space, but it's definitely not the gold rush that some people are making it out to be right now because really, this is different from other medicines. It's not the take-home medicine that you do every day unless you are doing it in a microdosing way. For many, many people, this might be a singular experience that they do in their life and then never ever come back to it. And that's not an easy thing to monetize. So, yeah, unfortunately, there are bad actors as much as there are good actors in this space. So I just thought it would be worth flagging that, even if I don't mention who they are.
yeah, that's excellent. I do appreciate you putting that point out there. I'm hoping that over the course of the next few years and things like that there is even more of an expansion in all of
Mm,
this than you've suggested.
mm.
I mean, even just taking the stigma out of it, sort of across the board and making it something that's not just for us freaks and hippies and whatever. But it's an important area of emphasis that for me, and I really appreciate you um, showing up for this, and you were really easy to get in touch with, and you jumped right on it, and I was just like, all
Sure.
right, this is excellent, and
Can I
it
ask you
means
a
a lot.
question as
Yes.
well? So you mentioned earlier about sort of DMT being a mentor to you, and I guess my question for you, and you may have discussed this on a previous podcast, apologies if you have, but what did that mentor teach you? I mean, like what would the previous you not know that the DMT was able to show you?
Well, let's see. Um, And no, it's not something that I've talked about quite a bit, probably more in the last year and a half than any time else in my life, because I didn't want to be pigeonholed as, oh, look,
Mm.
this is a drug guy.
Hmm.
And my outreach touches people, that are just in a very wide spectrum of understanding about all of this. My DMT experiences have, wow, this is really interesting. I was way to turn the tables, James. I really love this. My experiences have facilitated for me an expansion of how I view reality as a whole. And wow, it's actually even bringing up emotion for me. It's been so deep of how it has shifted my spiritual beliefs, I mean it even goes beyond that. I mean, just my entire view of reality and what my role is in this life experience. Um, and I've gained insights. A lot of times I come back from the experience and I know I've learned a lot,
Hmm.
but I can't even say, oh, here's exactly what I've learned. It's like there's, without sounding too flighty or whatever, like there's
Mm.
downloads that I'm being
Mm.
given. Sometimes I go with an intention of getting a clearer vision on something that I'm moving into or things like that. And then in subsequent dreams after the experience, I'm being shown things or it's realizations about how to expand what I do with energy dynamics of the healing work that I do. Uh, I mean, it's been fascinating. I I hold back from sharing the specifics of what I've seen in these worlds
Mm.
or
Hmm.
or who I've interacted with there, because it just could be a bit too much for some of my followers.
No, for
Um,
sure. Sorry,
yeah,
I ask as well because like the when we were going through sort of the background of I know that we've got to wrap up fairly soon, so apologies, I won't take this tangent too far. But when we were talking about my background and stuff, you talked about how I sort of first came to this was through the cannabis space, and when that happened, I was very aware that Professor Nutt was also doing some work in the psychedelic space, and we're all a product of our own environment, so I came to it with a bit of a hesitation, to say the least. Like sort of aware that this is something that people tell me is great, but I had had no personal experience or anything like that. And then I met a bunch of people that were doing it for end of life care and those in palliative care. So those were not a potentially long time left on this earth. And I think that that was my turning point in the space where I would speak to some of these people who are, in their late 70s or have gone through a lot of life, let's say, and have a lot of experiences to draw on. And they would say that, their psilocybin experience was one of the most important ones that they've ever done. And they've had, they've been married, they've had kids, they've, traveled the world and things like that. And I think, geez, like that's quite a big statement to make, is that this is the most important thing that someone has done, and it's something that still is, in somewhat criminal. And it was through those personal accounts from those people, and similar to what you were saying there about changing their entire worldview, or at least how they saw themselves fitting into this world, whether that's as the world continues, or their spirituality says that they will continue in this world, or whatever it might be. That part to me is actually relatively not important. It's more about the solace that they were able to come to through that experience in a time for them that was, obviously very stressful and very unknown. And it still brought a sense of knowing to them in those last moments. So, yeah, to end in the most poetic way I possibly can, I think that really for me was that turning point where I realized, okay, this is something I want to be able to help people to achieve as well. And I'm not a medical person, so I can't do it that way, but I can do it through hopefully expanding access to as many people as possible.
absolutely appreciate that. Um, I've always said that. psychedelics certainly aren't for everybody, and I would recommend them doing research and everything else, and I would never want anyone to use myself as an example of what anyone should be doing. But there isn't anything I would change about my some of my other psychedelic experiences. But as far as DMT goes, it has proven to be such a integral part of my experience and my expansion and what it's brought to me on all the different levels. I really can't even think of anything negative that I could say just in my own exploration and
Mm,
everything else. I don't know how that would translate to other people. I've heard all sorts of different stories from people over the years, and it's all fascinating. But the whole
mm,
psychedelic realm, for me, I feel like um, it's kept me to be able to be at a very high level of energy and positivity and focused on mission and purpose here that if I had never had experiences with psychedelics, I'm not sure how I would have found all of that. So I feel like
mm, mm,
that's for me why they made their way into my life, and that to me has been the highest use for them. And so wow, this has taken quite a fun turn, and I do appreciate you so much. I look forward to possibly meeting you one day. I will follow your
mm.
schedule and see when you're doing anything in the U.S. or anything like that, and possibly in a year, maybe touch base with you again
Yeah, for sure.
and see where we're all at with everything. But thank you so much for being on the It's All Good show and bringing out some things that I had no idea were going to come out in this discussion.
No, it's been a real pleasure, and I would love to absolutely come back. So yeah, keep me in mind. And just a very last minute plug for me. If anyone is interested in following the work I do, I have my own website, and that's at silonautica.com. And I'm sure we'll put a link in the show notes. But thank you very much for having me on today. I appreciate that.
Thank you, and have an excellent rest of your day.
Cool.